endeavouring to carve his own name in polar history, sought the last great polar trophy, the overland crossing of the continent of Antarctica from the Weddell Sea to the Ross Sea via the South Pole. His plan required 2 ships with 2 complements of men. Shackleton was to take his ship, the Endurance, to the Weddell Sea, and Mackintosh, the leader of the Ross Sea party, was to take his ship, the Aurora, to the Ross Sea. With 2 ships and 56 men, it was the largest and the best provisioned expedition of discovery sent out of England for 150 years since the time of Sir John Franklin's ill-fated expedition in the Arctic in 1845. That ill-fated expedition also had 2 ships, the Erebus and the Terror, and had 129 men. All were lost. This is a bit slow in advancing, so bear with me. This is Aeneas Mackintosh, one of Shackleton's most loyal men. He was appointed in charge of the Ross Sea party. He was, as I mentioned, one of Shackleton's most loyal men. He lost an eye on Shackleton's Nimrod expedition in 1909. A hook carrying provisions onto the ship got loose, hit him in the face, and he lost his eye, which had to be removed on the ship itself. He was sent back to New Zealand to recover, but was more concerned with who would fulfill his position on the ship than he was with looking after his own health. He was truly a loyal Shacjkleton man. This is Mackintosh and his wife Gladys Campbell on their wedding day in 1912. Now, Shackleton's instructions. The Aurora was to depart Hobart in Tasmania as early as possible in November 1914, and to commence depot laying on the Ross ice shelf by the beginning of December. In the first season, that's from December 14 to March 15, depots were to be laid down as far as 80 degrees south. I hope you're able to see my notations on the map there. In the second season, from October 1915 to March 1916, further depots were to be laid down at 81, 82 and 83 degrees south, and the final depot was to be laid down at 83 degrees 30, near Mount Hope at the foot of the Beardmore Glacier. Shacjkleton reckoned that he and his 5-man overland party from the Weddell seaside could traverse the continent via the South Pole and bring their own supplies to keep them going until they reached the bottom of the Beardmore Glacier at 83 degrees south. From then on, their own supplies would run out and they would rely on the depots laid down by Aeneas Mackintosh and his Ross Sea party. The whole story here takes place within the area marked in yellow. That's the Ross Sea area leading to the bottom of the Beardmore Glacier. Now, all previous Antarctic expeditions were on an out and back basis. This one was different. There was no going back, only forward. Shackleton could carry his own supplies as far as 83 south, and as I mentioned, after that he was relying on the depots laid down by the Ross Sea party. This is Aurora in Sydney in 1914, as final preparations were made to bring her to Hobart to commence the journey south. The fitting out proved costly. Shacjkleton was naturally more consumed with the planning for his own endurance expedition on the Weddell Sea side, the far side of Antarctica. He presumed that there would be little or no difficulty in Mackintosh fitting out the Aurora to commence the Ross Sea party, but there were problems. Money was short, supplies were low. Mackintosh had to rely on the goodwill of the New Zealand and the Australian authorities to provision the ship. After much delay, Aurora finally left Hobart in Tasmania on December the 24th, almost 2 months behind schedule. 28 men and 18 dogs on board. And any of these photographs you'll see were taken by the Ross Sea party's official photographer, the Reverend Arnold Spencer Smith. The 3-week journey to the ice was one of good companionship, good food, good humour. There was many a bout of seasickness, but whereas Mackintosh was no Captain Bligh, he didn't run his ship like the ship the Bounty, but equally he reckoned that lying in a bunk was not the best cure for seasickness. Sending the men up the rigging was by far a better cure. Their spirits were high on that journey south, believing that as part of Ernest Shackleton's first expedition to cross the Antarctic continent from coast to coast, they were sailing into polar history. Little did they know that they were sailing into historical oblivion, or that 3 of their number would not return. Those of you who've heard some of my earlier talks will know that the 3 huts in Ross Island played significant parts in all the stories of expeditions of that heroic age. In this story, 2 huts played a big party. This is Captain Scott's Discovery Hut at Hut Point, which was built for his Discovery 1901-1903 expedition. It's the nearest point on the landmass of Ross Island before you enter the Ross Ice Shelf, the 400-mile flat sea of frozen ice that brings you to the Transantarctic Mountains. The second hut, called the Cape Evans Hut, was built by Captain Scott for his 1910-1913 Terra Nova expedition. And this is a map which you've seen before and you will see again, because it's important to show the relative locations of Cape Evans and Hut Point at the bottom of Ross Island in McMurdo Sound in Antarctica. At the end of January 1915, the Aurora, the Ross Sea Party ship, arrived at Hut Point, as I mentioned, almost 2 months behind Shackleton's planned schedule. There were frantic preparations in that last week of January 1915. Being nearly 2 months behind schedule, Mackintosh was fearful that they would not be able to meet their planned time schedule and that they would not be able to bring the supplies to the level that Shackleton required in the first season. The main depot was at Minna Bluff, which is just beyond 79 degrees south, and that was where the bulk of the supplies were to be cached, later to be taken to fulfill the depots further south all the way to 8330 south. To get things into perspective, it's important to keep in mind that each degree of latitude is 60 nautical miles. That sounds like a walk in the park on a normal summer's day, but in the conditions of Antarctica, every 60 miles is a major achievement. In the first season, they were planning to drop off supplies 160 miles south, all in all a round trip of 320 miles. 3 teams set out in that last week of January 1915 to lay down the depots on the Ross Ice Shelf. Things went wrong from the very beginning. The dogs were not acclimatized properly. They were put to use almost immediately they arrived off the ship at Hut Point. They were not acclimatized, the teams were not ordered in the way that they should have been ordered. Mackintosh didn't have great experience of the dogs and mixed and matched the different breeds to the point where there was continual fighting and little or no work was achieved with the dogs. Shortly after they commenced on their journey, 1 team had to return from Minna Bluff. The dogs were totally unsatisfactory. 2 continued on to 80 degrees south to try and fulfill their instruction in the first season. This is a photo of Erebus, a Samoyed, one of the 18 dogs. They were mainly Canadian Huskies with some Samoyeds, with the 28 men on board Aurora as they departed Hobart in December 1914. The dogs were fully acclimatized in Hobart. They were in great shape when they left, but by the time they reached Cape Evans, after Aurora's 3-week voyage from Hobart, they were in a very pitiable condition. Shacjkleton didn't pay much attention in his basic instruction to Macintosh to reach the depots. He felt that they were going over ground that was already well covered. Shacjkleton had pioneered this route in 1907-1909 on his Nimrod. Scott had also followed that route on his 1910-1912 Terra Nova, and therefore Shacjkleton felt that being a known route, they were not likely to encounter any difficulties. But Shacjkleton overlooked what the Antarctic can throw at you. What might have been passable terrain 3 years ago might become totally impassable terrain now. There were crevices where they were not expected. As a result of the crevices, they had to detour from their planned route and travel 30 and 40 miles inland, which did nothing to speed up their journey, but only added to the turmoil of their depot laying achievements. They also encountered what had not been encountered before by these men, sastrugi, which is the heaps of snow that the wind, snow and ice that the wind heaps up, sometimes to a height of 2 or 3 feet, making it virtually impossible to pull or haul or drive sledges over that type of ground. They therefore had to resort to man-hauling and relaying. By the relaying, when they encountered these sastrugi, they would offload the supplies from the sledge, walk carrying the supplies 3 miles beyond the sastrugi, then walk back, carry the next batch of supplies over the sastrugi. So as a result, for every 1 mile covered, they had to walk 3 miles. This was their marking of the various depots. The continent of Antarctica is at a total whiteout. It is impossible to be able to identify any landmark one from the other. So to mark their depots, they built cairns like this with flags flying up to 20 feet to make sure that they were seen from a distance away. I mentioned in that first depot laying season, nothing went according to plan. Of the 18 dogs that were taken, between fighting, between not being acclimatized properly and not having the correct food, 14 of the 18 dogs either died or were killed by each other, leaving just 4 dogs that were left. This was a serious blow to the hopes of the Ross Sea Party to be able to fulfill their instruction to Shacjkleton. As regards the ship, Shacjkleton's plan was that his ship, the Aurora, would secure her winter quarters in McMurdo Sound, and that the ship would be used as accommodation for the men who were not out on the trail. There was no need, therefore, to offload supplies and provisions, as these could be taken from the ship as and when required for the sledging journeys. In preparation for her overwintering, the Aurora had her fires drawn, her boiler blown down, and her engines partially dismantled, all designed to guard against undue strain during the winter cold. This is Aurora in her winter quarters up Cape Evan. As I mentioned, very, very little was unloaded. There was no need to unload anything. The men would stay on the ship, and the others would be at the hut just 100 yards away. What they didn't encounter, and what they didn't expect, was that on May the 8th, 1915, disaster struck. The ship was carried away in a blizzard. There were 18 men still on board the ship. There were 10 men ashore. 4 were at Cape Evans carrying out scientific work, and 8 others were still out on the trail laying the depots. On June the 2nd, 4 weeks after the ship had disappeared, and with the sea ice now sufficiently firm, the men who had been out on the trail returned to Cape Evans. The 6 men returned, joining up with the 4 who were there. Thus, the 10 men, who would forever be known as the Ross Sea Party, finally came together. And because their names are not etched in history, I always think it's important to mention them at this stage. You can read the names, you can read the countries, and you can read the ages. Ernest Wilde, whose image is up on the screen there, was a brother of Frank Wilde, who, by an extraordinary coincidence, was at that moment with Ernest Shacjkleton on the far side of the Antarctic continent. These men are anything but household names, and yet by the time I come to the end of this story, I'm sure you'll agree with me that their names deserve to be remembered, and they don't deserve to be forgotten as they have been for the last 110 years. I mentioned earlier on that when the ship broke its moorings and drifted away, no supplies had been landed. So therefore the 10 men who were now at Cape Evans had no supplies whatsoever to lay down for Shacjkleton, who they expected to come from the south and rely on their depots for his provision. This is a rather higgledy-piggledy picture taken of Cape Evans, which shows that the food supplies and the provisions were scattered all around the hut. This was for a very, very good reason. No provision, no food, no supplies were ever stored in any of the Antarctic huts, for a reason that if there was a fire, everything was lost. Fire was a great source of concern, and they wanted to make sure that if there was a fire, that none of the provisions or the stores or the supplies would be lost. So they were higgledy-piggledy stored around the various huts to a range of maybe 400 or 500 meters. They realized they had nothing. They still had to fulfill their obligation to Shacjkleton to make sure that he and his men survived their overland trip. They spent some time scavenging what was left around the house. They found a certain amount of food from the time Scott was there 4 years earlier. The supplies, the food, the biscuits, the pemmican was 4 years old, but they reckoned it was still edible. They really had to scavenge. They were very, very short of cooking equipment. They found 2 Primus stoves that were near the end of their time, but they were still functioning. And the Primus stove to the Antarctic traveller is exactly the same as the oxygen to a deep sea diver. You cannot survive without it. The sun reappeared in August of that year after 4 months of total darkness. Bad weather again prevented the start of the depot laying until October of 1915. They now had to sledge out 400 miles out and 400 miles back. They decided that the 4 remaining dogs who survived the previous year's depot laying were not worth taking, so the 9 men had to pull 3 sledges. There was 4,000 pounds weight in the 3 sledges to be pulled by 9 men without dogs. This was not what they expected. They suffered hugely on that outward trip. They only averaged 1.5 miles per day when they were hoping to do 10 miles per day. They were totally dispirited. They changed their plan. They returned to Cape Evans, and they decided that they couldn't progress further without the 4 dogs. These 4 dogs were to be their saviour. They had to cover 800 miles, 400 out and 400 back. They started out in October 1915. 4 days into the journey out, one of the Primus stoves that they had scavenged from Cape Evans packed up. That meant that one of the teams of 3 men had to be sent back, because 1 Primus stove could not possibly look after 9 men. They now had only 5 men to lay the depots plus the 4 dogs, and they still had to haul the 4,000 pounds. The work of hauling was so dispiriting that I think it's helpful if I read something from Richard's diary, which he wrote during one of the days when there were 10 hours in the traces, only covering 3 or 4 miles. It was trudging along hour after hour, day after day. There was no conversation on the trail. One step forward was little in advance of the last, and all our energies were needed for the job in hand. The silence was profound, except that is, unless a blizzard was raging, and then the tiny party was lost in a howling, shrieking wilderness of hurling snow. The hours of a day's march seemed endless. I do not know what went on in my companions' minds over these months on the march. I only know that in my case, I used to perform long, useless computations of one sort or another in my head. This did not seem to be a deliberate act on my part, but rather an automatic reaction to the monotony that was forced on us, and an anodyne to the weariness of the body. We seldom thought of the outside world. We had heard nothing from it since December 1914. We had left all that behind. It seemed quite unreal. The only reality to us was what we saw about us. That gives an indication of the mental state that these men were in. As regards Spencer Smith, who was the padre among them, in the diary that he left, he mentioned that his way of dealing with the sheer monotony of the drudgery of putting one foot in front of the other, step by step by step, was he would compose a sermon in his mind in English. He would then attempt to translate that sermon into Latin. Then in his mind he would attempt to translate it from Latin into French, and then back into English to see did he end up with the same sermon as he started with. They had incredible fortitude, these men, and the fact that they were able to fulfill their function in such dispiriting and hopeless situation is truly awe-inspiring. By this stage, that's the Reverend Spencer Smith. He was suffering from scurvy. McIntosh was also suffering from scurvy. The story from then on is one of a grim struggle to get back. McIntosh was now off his feet, hanging onto the rear of the sledge. They jettisoned everything to lighten the loads. They abandoned the second sledge and made do with just one, with Spencer Smith and McIntosh on it. They left a trail of shovels, ice picks, the sledge meter itself, and anything else which could be discarded. They were now in distress. Hayward was also starting to suffer, and he needed to have his foot massaged every evening at rest. This is one of the rare photographs taken of the Ross Sea party as they encountered their worst days. February 1917, some 22 days after they had turned for home, and after 127 days out on the trail, fate again dealt them a cruel blow. A blizzard struck them that day, one which was to keep them confined to their 2 tents for 12 days. They had 3 days' rations left on the day the blizzard struck. They reduced to half rations, then quarter rations, then starvation rations. They were out of oil, so they had no hot food. They had no choice left but to go out in the blizzard and try to find the next depot, estimated some 10 miles away. Spencer Smith could travel no further. McIntosh could travel no further. So they agreed to leave Spencer Smith and McIntosh in the tent with Wild to look after them, while the remaining men attempted to reach the next depot to see could they get oil and food and supplies. They had a major battle again against the elements. The dogs were absolutely vital to this. There were 3 Canadian Huskies, Oscar, Towser and Gunner, and 1 Samoyed called Con. The men realized that the dogs were their last hope, so whenever they stopped for the evening, they gave the dogs a hot hoosh to try and keep their strength up, even at the expense of the men themselves having a cold meal. The dogs were their saviour. When they got to the next depot and reloaded the supplies and getting ready to go back to rescue Spencer Smith and McIntosh, who were left in the tent some 15 miles back in the trail, the dogs, sensing that there was more punishment in store for them, refused to turn south. Joyce tried everything to get the dogs to turn south. They refused. They dug their heels in and insisted on heading north. The only trick that Joyce could play on them was to set them out north and bring them around in a huge circle, adding maybe 6 or 8 miles to his journey. The dogs didn't realize they were in a circle, and he eventually got them to head south, where they rescued the 2 remaining members who were stricken with scurvy. Spencer Smith died on March the 6th, 1916. He was the first of the 10 men of the Ross Sea Party to suffer. He never complained, sat on the sledge to be dragged for almost 150 miles, and died on March the 6th. His death went very, very hard with the rest of the men. At this stage, McIntosh could go no further. He appealed to the men to leave him in his tent so that he could not delay any possible progress with the remainder. It was while he was in this tent that he wrote that letter that I wrote at the very beginning of this little talk. Again, I've mentioned the relative position of the 2 huts at Cape Evans, at Ross Island, Hut Point and Cape Evans. There were 4 men at Cape Evans. There were 5 men still out on the trail. There should have been 6, but Spencer Smith had died. They got back to Cape Evans miraculously and regained their strength. While they were at Cape Evans, McIntosh was very, very keen, at Hut Point to regain their strength. While they were at Hut Point, McIntosh was very, very keen to see could he get over to Cape Evans to check if any of the remaining men were still alive, and if so, how many of them. On May the 8th, 1916, against the advice of Ernest Joyce and the other of the men, McIntosh attempted to go over the then infirm sea ice to see could he get to Cape Evans with the men. Hayward went with him. The 2 of them walked down to the shore, walked onto the sea ice, and were never seen again. We now have 3 deaths on the 10-man Ross Sea Party. The remaining 3 men, Wild, Joyce and Richards, had to wait for a further 68 days before they could cross from Hut Point to Cape Evans. They left on July the 18th, 1916, with a full moon. But nature, as often happened in those areas, had the last laugh. They were halfway across the firm sea ice between Hut Point and Cape Evans when everything went black on them. The full moon disappeared. That night, July the 15th, 1916, was a full eclipse of the moon. They were in total darkness. They wandered around for 15 or 20 minutes until the moon reappeared, and then they continued their journey to Cape Evans, where they joined the remaining 3 men who were there. All the time, they were wondering and asking, what happened to Shacjkleton? They couldn't have known that the Endurance had never even reached Antarctica, or that Shacjkleton had never ever set foot on the continent. What's also of significance is during that period when the men were holed up in Cape Evans, with the 4 dogs that were left, Towser, Gunner, Oscar, 3 Canadian Huskies, and Con the Samoyed. The 3 Canadian Huskies turned on Con the Samoyed and killed the poor dog. They had no idea what had happened to Shacjkleton. As I mentioned, they couldn't have known. that he never ever set foot in the continent, and yet they kept wondering day after day after day, is he likely to come from the south? They eked out a miserable existence at Cape Evans for the remainder of that year. Again, nobody knew where they were. Nobody in the world knew whether they were still alive. There was no communication. On the 10th of January of the following year, 1917, Stevens was taking his usual morning readings of the anemometer on the hill behind Cape Evans. He went up at 4 o'clock in the morning. It was broad daylight. This was the middle of the austral summer. He suddenly saw a puff of smoke coming from behind an iceberg out in McMurdo Sound. He couldn't believe what he saw. He waited. Again, there was another puff of smoke. He knew it was a ship. He raced down to the hut and said to the men in an excited voice, "There's a ship, there's a ship, there's a ship." Nobody could believe. They all ran out of the hut. They saw the ship coming, and they knew then that they were saved. It was the Aurora. Shacjkleton was on board the Aurora. After he had rescued his men from the Elephant Island, he travelled halfway around the world to Australia and New Zealand and secured permission from the various governments and various sponsors to bring the Aurora to Hut Point, to the Ross Sea part of Antarctica, to find out what had happened to the men that he had deposited there almost 3 years before. This is a photograph of 6 of the 7 remainders of the Ross Sea party as they loaded their sledge and made the last journey across 3 miles of sea ice to meet Shacjkleton's ship. When they were within a short distance of the ship, they recognized that one of the men who was approaching them was Shacjkleton. They couldn't believe it. They expected him all the time to come from the south, and here he was 2.5 years later coming from the north. Shacjkleton, at a distance of 100 meters or so, shouted out, "How many of you are there?" When the reply came back, 3 dead. Shacjkleton and his 2 colleagues from the ship lay down flat on the ice, and this was known afterwards as a pre-arranged signal for Shacjkleton to tell the men on the Aurora of the number of those who had perished. I throw this in just for a little bit of light relief. This is a slide taken from the ship, the Aurora, after it broke its moorings and was stuck in the ice for 6 months before it eventually freed itself and went back to New Zealand. You can't quite see it here, but the sign behind the gentleman in the middle, the sign on the wall simply reads, "Life is just one goddamn thing after another." The men of the Aurora, the men of the Ross Sea party, when they rejoined the Aurora, were astounded to find that the World War I was still going on. They had not had proper food for nearly 2.25 years. They were unable to avail of the food that was made available to them on board the ship. Most of them developed serious stomach cramps. This is a photograph of the men on the Aurora after they were rescued. You can see Oscar the dog in the front there. This is a photograph of John Lacken Cope. The one on the left is on the day he rejoined the ship. The one on the right is after his first shower, change of clothes in 20 months. These are the survivors of the Ross Sea party with 3 of the dogs. After they left the hut at Cape Evans, they closed the door behind them, sailed away on January the 10th, 1917. The door of that hut remained closed for the next 40 years, when in 1957 an expedition from America arrived, and with a photographer from National Geographic. Thankfully, they didn't attempt to enter the hut, but the photographer from National Geographic reached through a window and took this photograph of the last half-eaten meal of the men of the Ross Sea party. That got incredible coverage in National Geographic of that time. These are the 7 survivors of the Ross Sea Party, washed and shaved after their 747 days without other human contact. If they reflected on what they had done, they would know that theirs was the only expedition in the history of British involvement in Antarctica over that 20-year period to have achieved every goal that was set to it. No other expedition achieved its goals. The Ross Sea Party did. In terms of sledging comparison, it's interesting to note that in Scotland in 1902, he had 95 days sledging, Shacjkleton in 1908, 120 days, Scott again in 1912, 190 days, 150 days, and the Ross Sea Party in 1915, 199 days. That brought an end to what became known as the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. It was the last time that dogs would be used in that fashion for exploration. Every expedition after that relied on mechanical transport. So the heroic age was replaced by the mechanical age. Shacjkleton's plan of doing the cross-transantarctic voyage from the Weddell Sea to the Ross Sea in 1916 had to wait another 40-odd years until 1957 for the transantarctic voyage to be completed. It happened in 1957-1958 with the British New Zealand expedition. Contained mechanical, and you've seen this photograph before, a very, very dramatic photograph of a tractor narrowly escaping being dumped down a crevasse. Now I hear you wonder, what in the name of goodness is a slide with the Minnesota starvation experiment 1945 doing in a presentation like this? Sadly, Minnesota is in the news for all the wrong reasons these days. But in 1945, it was very much in the news for all the right reasons. Coming up to the end of the Second World War, the powers that be in America felt that there were likely to be between 80 and 100 million Europeans suffering from the effects of the Second World War who were needing nourishment, food, and provisions. They didn't know how best to deal with that scenario. So the university in Minnesota established a starvation experiment in 1945. It probably wouldn't be allowed today because no ethics committee in any university is likely to approve of it. They wanted to find out what were the effects of enforced starvation on human beings. Of the 300 or 400 volunteers who entered for the program, 35 were selected. The program was due to last 12 months. For the first 3 months, they were given their normal food at an average daily intake of 3,000 calories. For the second 3 months, the daily intake of calories was reduced from 3,000 per day to 1,500 per day. For the following 3 months, the effects of the reduced calorific intake was studiously measured. The results were quite startling. The men behaved in a way that was totally unexpected. They lost all interest in each other's company. They lost the conversational ability. They had nightmares about eating food. They felt they were resorting to cannibalism. The effects on them were so severe that the people in charge of the venture effectively had to cut short the experiment because they couldn't be certain that the results would not go totally awry. The reason I mention that here is that it is now calculated that the 10 men of the Ross Sea Party for nearly 2.5 years survived on less than 900 calories per day. If 1,500 calories per day was to cause the men involved in the Minnesota starvation experiment to behave in that fashion, it is astounding that the men of the Ross Sea Party could fulfill their own duties. And significantly, when the ship broke its moorings on May the 6th, 1916 and sailed away, it contained all their provision of tobacco. Now, in those days, smoking was not as seen as it is nowadays. Everybody smoked. And anybody who has smoked will know that the enforced stoppage of tobacco is a very, very hard thing to take. But these men of the Ross Sea Party continued their entire duties with that deprivation. This is the cross on Windvane Hill at Cape Evans on Ross Island in Antarctica. It commemorates the 3 men of Shacjkleton's Ross Sea Party who died in 1916-1917. For 120 odd years, they have been forgotten. Many of Shacjkleton's men on these endurance are now household names. Nobody on this panel of 10 is a household name. They have been forgotten. I'd like to think that they're not forgotten now. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.